had a knack for understanding my emotions and offering comfort in her own unique way. Her sudden departure from this world had left a void in my heart, one that seemed impossible to fill. Yet, here I was, holding a letter from her, a letter that seemed to promise something beyond the grave. As I carefully opened the envelope, my hands trembled with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. Inside, I found words penned by her familiar hand, words that spoke of arrangements made long before her passing. She had entrusted a secret to me, a secret hidden within the confines of our family's chest. The thought of uncovering this secret filled me with a strange sense of urgency. Following her instructions, I made my way to her house, the home where she had lived with my brother-in-law, his wife, and their children. The house felt eerily silent, as if still mourning her absence. With trembling fingers, I located the secret compartment in the chest, the one she had mentioned in her letter. As I opened it, a rush of emotions overwhelmed me. Relief, fear, excitement, all jumbled together in a whirlwind of conflicting feelings. And there it was, the hidden door she had spoken of, concealed within the depths of the chest. With bated breath, I followed her instructions, opening the door to reveal its contents. But what I found inside was not what I had expected. Instead of treasures or heirlooms, I found a letter addressed to me, written by someone who shared my name. As I read the words on the page, my heart skipped a beat. The letter spoke of dreams deferred, of hopes dashed, and of the enduring kindness of my mother-in-law. In those lines, I saw reflections of my own struggles, my own fears, and my own dreams. I saw a woman who, like me, had faced the disappointment of unfulfilled desires, yet had found solace in the love and support of those around her. As I read on, I felt a sense of kinship with this other Nancy, a woman I had never met, yet who seemed to understand me in a way that few others did. And in that moment, I realized the true gift that my mother-in-law had left behind, not just a hidden door, but a legacy of love, empathy, and understanding that would endure long after her passing. About my mother-in-law's absence. It was unlike her to keep us waiting, especially for something as simple as going out for a meal. As minutes turned into an hour, my unease grew into a gnawing sense of worry. My husband and I exchanged concerned glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. It was highly unusual for my mother-in-law to be so tardy, particularly when she knew we had plans. Despite our attempts to call her, there was no response, only the hollow ring of her unanswered phone echoing in the silence. With each passing moment, my mind conjured up increasingly dire scenarios. What if something had happened to her? What if she was in trouble? The thought of her facing any kind of danger sent shivers down my spine. Sensing my growing anxiety, my husband suggested we go and check on her. Hastily, we made our way to her house, our footsteps echoing in the empty streets. As we approached the familiar door, a sense of foreboding washed over me. I hesitated for a moment before reaching out to knock, fearing what we might find on the other side. To our relief, the door swung open, revealing the dimly lit interior of my mother-in-law's home. But as we stepped inside, our relief quickly turned to confusion. The house was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual signs of life. There was no sound of laughter from my brother-in-law's children, no scent of cooking wafting from the kitchen. It was as if the entire house had been abandoned. "Mom?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. But there was no response, only the hollow silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. With growing apprehension, we began to search the house, calling out for my mother-in-law at every turn. But no matter where we looked, she was nowhere to be found. As the minutes stretched into hours, my worry turned to fear. What had happened to her? Where could she have gone? And why hadn't she told us about her plans? In that moment, surrounded by the empty rooms of her home, I realized just how much she meant to me. She had been more than just a mother-in-law, she had been a confidant, a friend, a source of comfort in times of need. And now, as I stood in the silence of her abandoned house, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of loss. Without her warmth and kindness, the world suddenly seemed a darker, lonelier place. A stark contrast to the somber atmosphere surrounding the adults. It was as if life continued on its usual course, oblivious to the gaping void left by my mother-in-law's passing. Despite our grief, my husband and I found ourselves caught up in the whirlwind of funeral preparations. There were decisions to be made, arrangements to coordinate, and relatives to notify. Each task seemed to blur into the next, a relentless stream of responsibilities that demanded our attention. As we gathered with family to bid farewell to my mother-in-law, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. My brother-in-law's demeanor, though outwardly composed, seemed to betray an underlying reluctance, a subtle resistance to the solemn proceedings. Throughout the wake and funeral, he performed his duties as the chief mourner with a sense of detachment that bordered on indifference. It was as if he were going through the motions, fulfilling his obligations out of obligation rather than genuine sorrow. And yet, amidst the mourning and the condolences, there were moments of discord that threatened to overshadow the solemnity of the occasion. My brother-in-law's abrupt exits and his wife's aloof demeanor drew disapproving glances from relatives, casting a shadow over the proceedings. Despite our efforts to maintain decorum, tensions simmered beneath the surface, fueled by resentment and unspoken grievances. My husband and I found ourselves caught in the middle, torn between our loyalty to my mother-in-law and the need to keep the peace within the family. As the funeral drew to a close, we were left to grapple with the aftermath of my mother-in-law's passing, the weight of her absence looming large in our hearts. In the days that followed, we struggled to come to terms with the void left by her departure, seeking solace in each other's presence as we navigated the uncertain terrain of grief and loss. As an excuse for leisure rather than a time for mourning, the blatant disregard for the solemnity of the occasion only fueled my growing frustration and resentment towards my brother-in-law's family. With a sense of determination, I made my way to my parents-in-law's house, the letter clutched tightly in my hand. The familiar path seemed to stretch out before me, each step bringing me closer to unraveling the mysteries hidden within the chest. Arriving at the house, I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The air felt heavy with the weight of my mother-in-law's absence, a palpable reminder of the void left by her passing. With trembling hands, I made my way to the chest, the letter burning a hole in my pocket. As I followed her instructions, a sense of anticipation coursed through my veins, mingled with a tinge of apprehension. But as the hidden compartment revealed its secrets, my fears were replaced by a profound sense of awe. Inside, nestled among forgotten treasures, was a testament to my mother-in-law's love and foresight, contact information for the family lawyer, instructions for handling her affairs, and a final directive to ensure that I opened the chest alone. With each item I uncovered, I felt a renewed sense of gratitude towards my mother-in-law, a woman whose kindness and generosity knew no bounds. Despite her absence, her presence seemed to linger in the room, a guiding light in the darkness of grief. As I carefully gathered the contents of the chest, a sense of purpose washed over me. It was a reminder that even in death, my mother-in-law continued to watch over us, guiding us through the trials and tribulations of life. With a renewed sense of resolve, I made my way back home, the letter clutched tightly in my hand. Though the pain of her loss still lingered, I found solace in the knowledge that her love would always be with me, guiding me through the darkest of times. As I sat there, my heart sank at the realization of what was unfolding before me. The will, bearing my mother-in-law's signature, outlined the distribution of her assets, all of which were to be inherited by my brother-in-law and his wife. The room seemed to spin as I struggled to process the implications of the document before me. It was a gut-wrenching blow, a betrayal of the trust and love that my mother-in-law had shown me throughout the years. As my sister-in-law continued to speak, her words dripped with smug satisfaction, a cruel reminder of the true nature of my brother-in-law's family. Their eagerness to seize my mother-in-law's estate, even in the midst of mourning, filled me with a sense of righteous indignation. But amidst the anger and disbelief, there was also a glimmer of resolve. I refused to let my mother-in-law's legacy be tarnished by their greed and deceit. With a steely determination, I vowed to fight for what was rightfully mine, to honor her memory and protect her wishes. As the meeting drew to a close, I left my parents-in-law's house with a heavy heart, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me like a leaden cloak. But in that moment of darkness, I also found a flicker of hope, the knowledge that I was not alone in this fight, that my husband stood by my side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, we would confront the injustices perpetrated by my brother-in-law's family, armed with the truth and the unwavering belief in my mother-in-law's love. And though the road ahead would be fraught with obstacles, I knew that as long as we stood together, we would emerge victorious in the end. At the lawyer's words, my brother-in-law and his wife visibly tensed, their facades of confidence crumbling under the weight of suspicion. The accusation of forgery hung heavy in the air, casting a shadow of doubt over the legitimacy of the document they had presented. As my husband pointed out the discrepancies in the handwriting, I felt a surge of apprehension wash over me. Could it be possible that my brother-in-law and his wife had resorted to such deceitful tactics to claim my mother-in-law's estate? Their vehement denials only served to fuel my suspicions, their protests ringing hollow in the silence of the room. It was clear that the lawyer's presence had struck a nerve, exposing the cracks in their carefully constructed facade. With each passing moment, the tension in the room grew palpable, a silent battle of wills unfolding before my eyes. My brother-in-law's once confident demeanor wavered, his attempts to deflect attention only serving to further incriminate him in the eyes of the law. As the lawyer meticulously dissected the document before him, pointing out inconsistencies and irregularities, my brother-in-law's protests grew increasingly desperate. But no matter how hard he tried to defend himself, the truth remained undeniable: the will was a forgery, a crude attempt to cheat me out of my rightful inheritance. In that moment, the facade of unity that my brother-in-law's family had so carefully crafted began to crumble, revealing the ugly truth beneath. Their greed and deceit had been laid bare for all to see, their attempts to manipulate the situation only serving to expose their true colors. And as the realization dawned upon me, I knew that the battle for my mother-in-law's legacy was far from over. But armed with the truth and the unwavering support of my husband and the lawyer, I was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, determined to uphold my mother-in-law's wishes and protect her legacy from those who sought to tarnish it. With a look of disbelief mingled with relief. It was clear that my mother-in-law had anticipated every possible scenario, leaving behind a trail of clues to ensure that her wishes were carried out without interference. As the lawyer laid out the evidence before us, my brother-in-law's protests grew increasingly feeble, his attempts to deflect blame falling on deaf ears. It was a damning indictment of his character, a stark reminder of the lengths to which he and his wife had gone to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. But in the face of overwhelming evidence, their denials rang hollow, their excuses nothing more than desperate attempts to escape the consequences of their actions. And as the truth emerged, I felt a sense of vindication wash over me, knowing that my mother-in-law's legacy would be protected, her wishes honored in the end. With the notarized will and the life insurance certificate in hand, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to see justice served. My brother-in-law's attempts to manipulate the situation had been thwarted, his greed laid bare for all to see. And as the dust settled and the truth emerged, I knew that my mother-in-law could finally rest in peace, her legacy safeguarded from those who sought to exploit it for their own gain. In the end, it was her love and foresight that triumphed, casting aside the shadows of deceit and greed to reveal the enduring power of family and integrity. As my sister-in-law's violent outburst escalated, I felt a surge of fear and anger coursing through me. The pain from her blow radiated through my skull, a stark reminder of the depths of her cruelty and greed. Despite my husband and the lawyer's attempts to restrain her, she continued to lash out, her words dripping with venom and hatred. It was clear that she was determined to claim my mother-in-law's estate by any means necessary, even if it meant resorting to violence. But as my husband reached for his phone to call the police, I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness and disbelief at the sight before me. How had it come to this? How had a family once united by love and kinship descended into such chaos and animosity? As my sister-in-law continued to rant and rave, her eyes ablaze with fury, I realized that there was no reasoning with her. Her mind was consumed by greed and jealousy, her heart hardened against the bonds of family and loyalty. And as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, I knew that the consequences of her actions would be swift and severe. But amidst the chaos and turmoil, I clung to the hope that someday, she would come to regret her choices, that she would realize the true cost of her greed and selfishness. But for now, all I could do was wait, my heart heavy with sorrow and resignation. The battle for my mother-in-law's estate had taken a dark and unexpected turn, leaving behind a trail of brokenness and betrayal in its wake. And as I watched my sister-in-law being led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but wonder what had become of the family we once knew. When the police arrived shortly after, my husband and the lawyer explained the situation. My brother-in-law and his wife were then escorted away by the police. My husband and I thanked the lawyer and decided to send him home for the day. What was supposed to be a discussion about creating an estate division agreement turned into a chaotic ordeal. My husband and I nodded in agreement to bring a gift of apology the other day. My husband was deeply concerned about me being hit by my sister-in-law, but he seemed relieved when I told him the headache had completely subsided. In the light of the whole tumultuous sequence of events, I murmured, "It's been quite an intense time." Then my husband brought up something unexpected. "Hey, Amy seems to constantly flaunt about the children. You know, she always boasted about showing Mom 3 grandchildren and how great she was. And don't you think she's overly fixated on money?" Indeed, my sister-in-law had been excessively promoting her children and exhibited an intense fixation on money during the earlier altercation about money. Well, she has been quite vocal about the children for a while, and her obsession with money was indeed extreme. Her expression while hitting me was terrifying. "Yeah, you're right. It's a bit abnormal," my husband agreed. After saying that, he fell into a pensive silence. "What's wrong? Is there something bothering you?" I inquired. "Well, there's something bothering me, and I'm considering suggesting it to my brother. I think it might be a good idea to have DNA tests done for their 3 children," my husband confessed. "DNA tests?" "Yeah, and I'm also thinking about proposing a background check on Amy. Something doesn't sit right with me, it's just a gut feeling," he added. While I honestly thought it might be unnecessary, my husband's intuition had been accurate in the past. "Okay, if that's what Tom suggests, let's propose it to your brother later on," I agreed. When my husband told my brother-in-law about the matter, it seemed my brother-in-law ridiculed and yelled at him extensively. "Just because you don't have kids yourselves, don't doubt ours," he shouted. But before parting ways, he apparently insisted on taking materials about DNA testing from my husband. Perhaps my brother-in-law had some thoughts about it. The first revelation came from the DNA testing between my brother-in-law and his children. It turned out that 2 out of 3 of his children didn't share his blood. Oh, I was a bit suspicious of the youngest, because their face doesn't resemble either of us much, but I didn't expect the middle one to, my husband confessed, speechless at the news. Whether from this revelation or not, my brother-in-law thoroughly investigated his wife's background. The results were damning. It appeared that my sister-in-law had relationships with multiple men even before marrying my brother-in-law. Moreover, recently, her affairs were exposed to the wives of her lovers, who were now demanding compensation. As my sister-in-law spent more time at home than my brother-in-law did, she meticulously hid any notices like registered letters. Looking at the details, the total amount of compensation was far beyond what my sister-in-law earned or had in savings. In the end, my sister-in-law was hell-bent on seizing my mother-in-law's inheritance for herself at any cost. It was the natural progression of events, but my brother-in-law and sister-in-law ended up in a violent brawl, throwing things and exchanging blows until blood was shed. Unable to bear the noise, neighbors called the police, and both of them were taken into custody by the arriving officers. Already facing charges for forging our mother-in-law's will, they now faced additional charges of assault. Upon further investigation by the police, it emerged that they had committed theft and harassed wealthy individuals, among other offenses. Eventually, my brother-in-law and his wife ended up behind bars. As for the future of the 3 children left behind, my husband and I were deeply troubled. Since my mother-in-law's passing, we were the closest relatives to them. We considered taking them in, but after much deliberation, we decided against it. The children had been thoroughly indoctrinated by my brother-in-law and his wife to the point where they casually referred to my husband and me as "you childless incompetents." The eldest, at 14, should be old enough to discern right from wrong, and the youngest, at 7, should have some understanding of acceptable behavior. Yet every time they saw us, they smirked and spewed insults. Even with their parents in trouble or at the center of a controversy, their mindset remained unchanged. To hear our nephew, who is 14, saying we'd be better off being raised by childless idiots was beyond anything we could have imagined. Being subjected to such words, we couldn't summon any love for the children or any hope of raising them to be decent individuals. Ultimately, we reached out to my sister-in-law's parents and decided to sever ties with the children. From then on, it seems the children themselves understood our resolve. As our nephew remarked, "I'd rather live in grandma's old shack than with the brainless childless couple." With those words, we felt that it was the best way for them. For the record, we have not disclosed to the children the fact that the younger two are not biologically related to my brother-in-law. Whether we reveal the truth or not, we leave it to my brother-in-law and his wife's relatives to decide. My husband and I decided to move to a distant place using the inheritance left by my mother-in-law as our financial source and start anew. It's a place abundant with greenery and nature, where both my husband and I quickly felt at home. There's a charming waffle shop near our house, and every time we pass by it, we reminisce about my mother-in-law, wishing she could have gone there with us. Soon after the move, I was blessed with the child I had longed for. When the pregnancy test showed a positive result, I couldn't help but scream with surprise and happiness. Later, when I visited the obstetrician, the doctor confirmed without a doubt that I was pregnant. Both my husband and I shed tears of joy as we embraced each other. How much my mother-in-law would have rejoiced if she were still alive. Additionally, the entrepreneurial plan I had secretly been preparing for is progressing smoothly. Both my husband and I are working hard for the child on the way, enjoying fulfilling. Here I was, standing in the middle of the store, with my chest tight and my hands trembling. My nickname is Unpatriotic, a label Susan, my mother-in-law, had tossed at me during a particularly tense argument. It's a horrible name to be called, and completely untrue. Clearly, there must have been some misunderstanding. Susan was right in front of me, her face flushed as she struggled to find the right words. Just minutes ago, she had coldly instructed me to leave the store. I had walked out, tears blurring my vision, feeling utterly humiliated. However, after persistent calls from both Thomas, my husband, and Susan herself, I found myself back here, confronting her. Susan, who usually took any chance she got to belittle me, now looked panicked in a way I had never seen before. Moments ago, in a voice loud enough to echo through the store, she called me a stranger and told me to leave quickly. "What did you mean by that, Susan?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "Please, explain all of this. Why am I suddenly a stranger to you?" "I am Caroline, a 32-year-old office worker, married to Thomas for 4 years. We have no children yet. My life took a dramatic turn after the death of Thomas's father, Kingston. We lived far from my in-laws' house, in another state, until Kingston passed away from a heart attack. At his funeral, Thomas's uncle pulled him aside and whispered, 'You're the youngest, but the only son. Eventually, you'll return home, right? Make Mom feel at ease.' A few months after Kingston's death, Thomas made a startling announcement. 'I'd applied for a transfer a while back and got moved to an office near home,' he said, presenting it as a fait accompli. I was shocked. 'Why would you decide something so important without consulting me?' I protested. Thomas looked uncomfortable. 'I thought you'd object,' he admitted. 'Sorry, Caroline. You don't like my mom very much, do you?' That was an understatement. Indeed, I disliked Susan, but it seemed she harbored even greater disdain for me. When we lived out of state, visits to the in-laws were restricted to long vacations, which suited me just fine. Kingston had always been understanding. 'I'm happy just to see you a few times a year,' he used to say with a warm smile. Susan, however, was different. Why can't you come at least once a month? It's not like you live overseas. Nancy visits twice a week, you know, she would nag. Thomas is the youngest of 3 siblings, with 2 older sisters, Nancy and Tracy. Tracy is reserved, but Nancy, both in appearance and personality, is a mirror image of Susan. They both live near the family home. I could only smile bitterly whenever Susan made such comparisons. Of course Nancy can visit twice a week if she lives close by, I thought to myself. Yet Thomas always stood his ground. Don't compare us to Nancy. We have work, and it costs a lot to fly back every time. And here I was, once again at the center of a whirlwind caused by family obligations and misunderstandings, seeking clarity amidst the turmoil. As I stood there in Susan's tastefully decorated living room, the tension was palpable. Thomas had always been my defender, and in the past, Kingston had been the mediator. This had made my strained relationship with Susan just about tolerable. But I knew the crux of Susan's disdain toward me revolved around children. I'll never forget that uncomfortable summer visit last year. Susan had looked me over critically and said, "Why can't you have children yet?" Her gaze made me feel as though I was under a microscope. "Sorry, but Nancy doesn't have any yet either," I had retorted quietly, noting that both Nancy and Tracy, who married before me, were also childless. I thought Susan should focus on her own daughters rather than badgering me. But her reply was sharp, "Nancy's married off, but you're different. As a daughter-in-law, you're expected to provide a proper heir." Her outdated views were more than just irritating. Moreover, she had once commented on the low birth rate, suggesting, "It's better to have more children for society." You don't want to be unpatriotic, do you? That word unpatriotic struck me as absurdly dramatic. Who even used such language? It was that moment when I truly realized how strange Susan could be. Recently, when I heard Susan was ill, even Thomas showed concern, which precipitated our decision to move closer. I was conflicted, knowing it meant quitting my job and increasing my interactions with Susan, a prospect I dreaded. I had even considered asking Thomas to move without me. However, a friend's social media post about her husband cheating during a business trip made me reconsider. Ultimately, I decided to accompany Thomas, rationalizing that we wouldn't be living together with Susan anyway. Susan appeared delighted when I agreed to move. 2 weeks later, she summoned me. "Caroline, let's have tea at my place," she had said. It was the first time I accepted such an invitation, although reluctantly. Upon arriving at the in-laws' house, both Susan and Nancy greeted me. Facing my 2 least favorite people simultaneously, I already wanted to leave. "Caroline, long time no see. Why haven't you visited since moving here?" Nancy's tone was laced with malice. Susan sighed heavily, adding, "Caroline, I was so happy you decided to live here, but it seems I was mistaken. You dislike me, don't you?" I was tempted to confirm her suspicions just to see her reaction, but I held back. "I don't dislike you, Susan. It's just that I've been feeling unwell due to the new environment," I explained, which was true. I had been suffering from fatigue and resting at home, a fact that Thomas had seemingly failed to communicate. Why was I called here today? Just to listen to their nasty comments? I wondered silently. It was ridiculous. Susan claimed that I disliked her, but wasn't it clearly the other way around? How could we possibly get along under these circumstances? Nancy suddenly snapped, her tone sharp and commanding. "How can you speak to your mother-in-law like that? Apologize to her. Say you're sorry." As I stood there, facing both Susan and Nancy, Susan's next words took me completely off guard. "You're right, I have been mean. I'm sorry, Caroline. Sorry about the child thing too, I was being nosy." I had braced myself for another scolding, half expecting some underlying malice, but there was none. Even Nancy appeared surprised by her mother's sudden shift in demeanor. Susan continued, her voice softening, "I just wanted to hold a grandchild. Nancy's husband is the cause of their issues, and Tracy seems to have fertility problems, so I hoped." Her voice trailed off. There it was, the hidden struggles of Nancy and Tracy. Despite understanding their secret, it was clear that Susan had displaced her frustrations onto me, which was unfair. Thomas and I had discussed having children, and we're thinking about it. Please just leave us be for now, I responded, trying to maintain my composure. I even bowed my head slightly, acknowledging her apology, which seemed to prompt a conscience in her. Alright, I'm sorry. But do visit us sometimes, Susan conceded. Afterward, the atmosphere in the room shifted as Susan and Nancy began watching TV and having tea, as if the earlier tension had been a fabrication. Susan commented on the TV announcer, I like this announcer. She talks so energetically and brightly. Glancing at the TV, I recognized Susan's favorite local female announcer. A fleeting thought crossed my mind, would being more outgoing like that announcer have helped me gel better with Susan and Nancy? It was a silly thought. I was relieved to have aired my feelings. Perhaps, I thought, things could improve between Susan and me. However, my hopes were abruptly dashed that very night. Thomas came home and immediately started yelling. I heard from Mom you said you have no intention of getting along. Are you saying Mom was crying? His words baffled me. Why would Susan portray our conversation so differently? When leaving, Susan had even waved goodbye with a smile. What was going on? Did she have a split personality? His smile had seemed so genuine, but now it appeared to be a facade. I'm past being astonished, now I'm just scared, I admitted to myself. But the immediate problem was Thomas, who stood in front of me, fully believing his mother's twisted narrative. Look, Thomas, that's a misunderstanding on Susan's part. You know, I told her I don't know how to be friends under these circumstances. You know about my relationship with Susan, right? How does that turn into I don't want to be friends? I tried to explain, but Thomas didn't seem convinced. To add to the confusion, I received a message from Nancy. You were a bit cheeky to Mom after all the effort of moving here, weren't you? Come prepared to follow me here, then she should be a bit more patient. Thomas looked at me, his expression suggesting agreement with Nancy's message. She should be more patient, indeed. The layers of misunderstanding and miscommunication were piling up, making me feel more isolated than ever in this new environment. I moved here for Thomas, because I genuinely care about him. I didn't relocate just to appease Susan and Nancy. I wanted to be with you, Thomas, I said, looking straight into his eyes, trying to convey the depth of my feelings. But his reaction was hesitant, unclear. All right, I get it. Fine. Should we just get a divorce then? I blurted out, the word divorce slipping from my lips in a moment of frustration. This was the first time I saw real panic in Thomas's eyes. Wait, hold on a second. How does it jump to divorce? I just said I wanted you to get along better with my family. He didn't seem to grasp that his family didn't want to get along with me, which left me baffled. However, Thomas clearly didn't want a divorce. The next day, he returned late from work and mentioned he had talked to Susan. I talked to Mom, she said it was a misunderstanding and apologized. What a fuss. Then, almost dismissively, he added, and while talking to Mom today, I realized it's almost her birthday. Just dismissing the issue with a misunderstanding and the fuss over it irritated me deeply. But then Thomas had a suggestion. How about celebrating Susan's upcoming birthday at a fancy restaurant? And if we say it was your idea, maybe Mom's view of you will change, Thomas proposed, as if this plan could magically resolve everything. Fine, I'll handle the restaurant reservation. I'm thinking of inviting Nancy and others too, so make it for 7, okay? Okay, 7 it is, he agreed. I was filled with unease, but the day of Susan's birthday arrived. Over the past week, Thomas had been unusually cold, responding to my attempts at conversation with dismissive not really or yeah, which was unpleasant and unsettling. I wondered if something was wrong at work, but the true reason for his behavior remained elusive. As we arrived at the restaurant, Susan, Nancy, and Thomas and I were shown to our table. A worker glanced at us questioningly, which only added to my discomfort. Happy birthday, Susan, I said, trying to cut through the awkwardness. But Susan didn't even look our way. Instead, she addressed the room, "Thank you all for gathering for me today. I'm blessed to be celebrated by my family." Her deliberate ignorance felt like a slap in the face. It was childish, ridiculous. Nancy looked puzzled and remarked, "But I thought today was a family gathering." She glanced at me briefly, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. Tracy looked over, her expression worried. "Ah, I see. That's what this is. I'm being completely ignored. Well then, I'll ignore them right back and leave early." Just as I resolved to make my escape, the worker approached our table, his expression awkward. "I'm terribly sorry, but the reservation was for 6 people today." "What?" I was taken aback. "I distinctly reserved for 7. Did the restaurant staff make a mistake?" "No, it should be for 7. That's what I told them over the phone," I insisted. "Oh yes, but about a week ago we received a call to change the number to 6 from a gentleman," the worker explained. I was confused. Then, Thomas chimed in, "Yes, please, service for 6. Everyone's here now." As I looked at Thomas in disbelief, he accused, "I heard from Mom's side, Caroline, you've been bad-mouthing our family a lot, saying I don't earn enough and I'm insensitive. You really had a lot to say, huh?" It seemed that a week ago, when Thomas contacted Susan about this matter, she had filled his head with all sorts of lies. Foolish Thomas, without a doubt, believed it all. Angry, he called the restaurant pretending to be me, changed the reservation from 7 to 6, and the restaurant, hearing the same last name, didn't question it. How could he fall for the same trick in such a short time? Is he really that foolish? So, what? There's no point in me being here, right? Why was I even invited? I asked Thomas, my voice rising with frustration. "You need to apologize to everyone here and reflect on your actions," Thomas incredibly demanded. Of course, my answer was, "No way. I can't admit and apologize for things I didn't say. And I don't need a foolish husband who doesn't believe his wife, but listens only to his mom's side." Tears of frustration welled up in my eyes. Why did I even follow this man? Seeing me, Thomas started to panic, but it was too late. Susan watched us with a smug smile on her face, as if her plan had succeeded. "Thomas, it's fine. Next time, marry a younger, more docile daughter-in-law. That way, you might have kids." "I'd be happier with that," Susan spoke to Thomas, who looked lost, not knowing whom to believe, and buried his head in his hands. Then Susan turned to me, "Caroline, why don't you go back to your parents' house? A daughter-in-law is ultimately an outsider. I can't see you as family. You're not charming at all, so please leave quickly," Susan said triumphantly. I'd leave even without her telling me. I'd like to see someone who can get along with someone as twisted as her. I spat out my parting shot and left the restaurant, not looking back to see if Thomas, head in hands, would follow. Tears of frustration pricked my eyes again as I hurried away. Then, unexpectedly, I heard someone call out, "Caroline, wait." It was Tracy and her husband. Huh? Why? I was surprised and stopped, turning around to face them. Tracy's expression was serious. I couldn't stand it anymore. Mom and Nancy haven't changed since forever. I knew right away the gossip about you was false. When I said I cut ties, they just said do whatever you want. Sorry about Thomas, he's always been a puppet for Mom and Nancy. Tracy looked somewhat apologetic, her tone sincere. My husband's job is finally settling, and we're moving soon. Mom and them are mistaken, but we've decided not to have kids. Well, about Nancy's side. Tracy paused, and just then my mobile phone rang. The caller ID showed Susan. I scoffed, thinking like I'd answer that. As I was staring at the screen, a call from Thomas came in. What now? Seriously? I muttered, exasperated. Tracy and her husband exchanged looks. If you want, Caroline, how about going back to the restaurant? You might see something interesting, Tracy suggested, then they left, looking happy together. The phone kept ringing, and when I finally answered Thomas's call, his voice came through, panicked. "Ah, Caroline, I'm sorry. I didn't know it was a lie." In the background, I could hear noisy commotion. "It's too late to start over now. I'll send the divorce papers later." So I'm hanging up. I tried to end the call firmly. Wait. Can't you come back, please? It's a lifetime request." Thomas's plea sounded almost childish and desperate. Curious about Tracy's words, I hesitated, then decided to return to the restaurant. As I approached, a crowd had gathered around Thomas's table, and to my astonishment, the person speaking to Susan with a microphone was her favorite female announcer. "No, that's not it. We were just at some kind of misunderstanding." Susan struggled to articulate her words while Thomas and Nancy looked on, visibly uncomfortable. The announcer, pointing the microphone at Susan, asked, "But just now you loudly said in the restaurant you're an outsider, leave now. What did you mean by that? Please explain in detail." Nancy's husband, according to Tracy, had left offended like the rest of us. "What's going on? This is strange." It dawned on me, oh, that's right, something about TV. When I made the reservation, I'd forgotten that there was a TV recording in the restaurant. As I stood there, dumbfounded, a worker noticed me and approached. It was quite a scene earlier. Actually, after that, it turned out that there was a TV recording in the restaurant. That day, although the dining area was semi-private, conversations were easily overheard. "Sorry, can I have a moment for an interview?" Not long after I had left, the famous announcer had shown up with a smile, and Susan was overjoyed. "I'm a big fan." "An interview?" "Absolutely." It seemed she was quite enthusiastic about it, but the interview topic was unexpected. "We're doing a special on daughter-in-law and mother-in-law issues. We heard the heated argument earlier. The daughter-in-law left crying." "What happened?" Caught off guard by this unexpected question, the in-laws' faces turned pale. They couldn't possibly discuss the embarrassing truth about lying to drive away their son's wife on television. Then, Thomas spotted me. "Caroline, please, I can't let this shame be known. It was all my misunderstanding. Please." Thomas looked pathetic, but of course, I had no love left for him. I quietly gazed at Susan. "Oh, we usually call each other Carrie," Susan beckoned with a smile, trying to salvage the situation. So I approached silently. "You say you call each other Carrie, but how does the daughter-in-law see her mother-in-law?" When the microphone was pointed at me, I corrected, "Carrie? I've never been called that. I have been called unpatriotic for not having children several times, though. That too is because of Thomas." Susan and Nancy looked shocked by my words. My husband and I hadn't tried to have children for over 2 years. Too tired, not confident enough to raise children yet. That's what I had always been told. I paused, gathering my thoughts. Enough grounds for divorce, but when I first got sick and had to take leave from work, Thomas supported me. I liked his kindness, wanted to be with him. I followed him here, thinking a change of environment might help, but this was the result. No more tears left, no more attachment to this. Thomas, Susan, and Nancy looked embarrassed and pitiful. Seeing them like that gave me a bit of satisfaction. Is this going nationwide? I'll be looking forward to the broadcast. Talking with my favorite announcer and celebrating Susan's birthday, what a day. At my words, Susan looked like she might cry. "I'm sorry, please do something about this situation," she pleaded, clearly not used to being on this side of public scrutiny. Thomas and Nancy looked at me with pleading eyes, but I looked down on them quietly and said, "Well, since the daughter-in-law is an outsider, I guess I should leave. Goodbye." As I left the restaurant with a smile, still hearing shouts behind me, I walked away. In the end, Susan and her family didn't grant permission for the broadcast, so that footage never saw the light of day. Had it aired, it would have been a minor broadcasting incident. However, the incident was conspicuous enough and became the talk of the town, quickly spreading among relatives and acquaintances. After that day, I went back to my room, packed up, and returned to my parents' house. I sent the divorce papers to Thomas, but they weren't promptly returned. Thinking it might be time to involve a lawyer, Thomas unexpectedly showed up at my parents' house. My father, Stephen, dealt with him. Thomas deeply apologized, saying, "I plan to cut ties with my family from now on. I'll only believe in Caroline." But it was too late for his words to mean anything. Stephen simply said to Thomas, "Why didn't you realize such a simple thing earlier? What do you think you've done to Caroline over these years? Just write the divorce papers and leave quickly." Stephen, usually a gentle man, spoke with a face filled with anger. The divorce papers Thomas handed over, written in shaky handwriting, were hard to read but were successfully processed. It turns out Nancy was the real cause of their infertility, but she had blamed her husband. Now close to divorce, she no longer had time to frequent her in-laws' house. Thomas returned to his family home, living with Susan in a small town. They likely endured uncomfortable rumors for a while, but for me, it was a story of the past. 3 years after the divorce, I reconnected with a classmate from my hometown and remarried happily. We were soon blessed with a child, and now I have a 2-year-old daughter and am pregnant with our second. My mother-in-law is like an angel, so kind. Life is unpredictable,